Today I'm pleased to be following in Richard West's footsteps by speaking about Tolkien's verse drama, The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth Berthelm's Son. Let's just call it The Homecoming. Richard West commented on The Homecoming and concepts associated with that play in several essays. In Turin's Overmode, an essay that he published in the volume Tolkien's Legendarium, he outlined how Tolkien's interpretation of the Old English word overmode as overmastering pride, which Tolkien offered in a commentary attached to The Homecoming, also applied to the different versions of Turin's story, and in a later essay he extended this view to secondary characters. More recently, in the Verlin Flieger Festschrift, A Wilderness of Dragons, Richard drew attention to two facts that I'm not sure are widely recognized by Tolkien readers. Referring to The Homecoming, he states, well, now I can't move my, sorry. There we go. He states that it appears to be his only published drama and his only work of historical fiction. So let me start with that second fact, that The Homecoming is Tolkien's only historical fiction. It is based in primary world history and not his secondary world. According to early English historical chronicles, a battle took place in 991 at Malden on the east coast of Britain between English forces led by Berhtnoth and an invading Viking army, which defeated the English in the ensuing battle. This event is poetically recounted in the Old English poem, which we call the Battle of Malden. That Old English poem imagines Berhtnoth's death in battle, the flight of some cowards on the English side, and the heroic last stand of some of Berhtnoth's most loyal followers. Tolkien bases his play on this historical event, using details from chronicles and this poem to imagine the battlefield at night after the fighting is over and the Vikings have moved on. Two servants who were not in the battle, one a younger son of a minstrel named Tochthelm, or Tota for short, and one an older farmer named Tidwald, or Tida, are sent to search for and retrieve the body of their leader Berhtnoth to bring him back to the abbey at Ely for burial. Tolkien's play deals with these two men and their actions and discussions as they search among the dead warriors for their leader, fight off some corpse robbers, haul Berhtnoth's body into a wagon, and head back on the road to the abbey. But what I really want to focus on today is that other fact, not often recognized by readers, I think, that The Homecoming is Tolkien's only published play. We're used to thinking of Tolkien as a fantasy writer, poet, artist, letter writer, scholar, but The Homecoming also makes him a playwright. Although this is his only published play, we know that he had a personal interest in dramatic performance from an early age. In school, for example, he performed in plays. As Scull and Hammond tell us, in 1910, Tolkien acted as the inspector in Aristophanes' play The Birds, speaking in Greek, and also in Greek the following year, he performed the role of Hermes in Aristophanes' play Peace. And you can see him here pictured in that role. Near the end of 1911, his performance in English this time as Mrs. Malaprop in Richard Sheridan's The Rivals was praised as excellent in every way. While in school at King Edward's and later in Oxford, Tolkien also participated in debates, often in humorous speeches, which required putting on a distinct persona and taking a position in argument. Outside of his time in school, though, Tolkien also wrote plays in his youth as entertainments for his relatives. Scull and Hammond report that he probably wrote a farce called Cherry Farm in 1911, and in the following year, he wrote and played one of the parts in The Bloodhound, the Chef, and the Suffragette. As John Garth has pointed out, by thus limbering up in his early exercises as a writer, he was later able to apply the same skills, more finely tuned, of course, to the most serious topics and with the utmost gravity. Even later in life, though, we have evidence of Tolkien's dramatic flair. Picture him at the Oxford Summer Diversions in 1938, reciting from memory Chaucer's comic Nun's Priest Tale. John Bowers, in his book Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, imagines the scene. On the merrymaking occasion in summer 1938, Tolkien strode upon the stage costumed as Chaucer in a green robe, a turban, and fake whiskers parted in the middle, like the forked beard shown in early portraits like Ellesmere's. To help you imagine what that might have looked like, here's that portrait of Chaucer on the left, and on the right, Tolkien close to the age he would have been for this performance. The performance received good reviews in the Oxford Mail, and in the following year, Tolkien returned to perform Chaucer's Reeve's Tale, this time producing a shortened version of the tale for his performance. Now, Tolkien's recitations of Chaucer aren't the only performances that his audiences remember. Humphrey Carpenter reports how he used to start his lectures declaiming the opening lines of Beowulf in Old English. And although students complained that during lectures he mumbled and was hard to follow, his contrasting moments of dramatic performance left striking impressions. And we only have to listen to Tolkien's reading of Riddles in the Dark, which is available on YouTube, to hear his skillful performance of Gollum's voice, or more aptly, if you have access to it, listen to his reading of The Homecoming, available in a limited recording given to Tolkien conference attendees in 1992 by HarperCollins, in which Tolkien performs both voices in The Homecoming, distinguishing between the two characters with a lively performance. And of course, who knows what other performances he gave in his various clubs, doing reading, singing songs, and of course, reading to his children. So why didn't Tolkien publish more plays? I think that the answer lies in his preoccupation with his secondary world, a subject that he did not consider suitable for drama. In appendices E and F On Fairy Stories, Tolkien says that drama is anthropocentric and cannot cope well with fairy. Also, like other visual arts, drama imposes one visible form of what is being described as opposed to narrative art, which allows the reader or hearer to imagine their own picture. The Homecoming, however, is about the actions of men in the primary world, and it's to the features of this play that I'd now like to turn. I agree with critic Marie Nelson, who's written that The Homecoming has performance potential as a one-act play. However, I think its publication and early performance history have militated against recognition of this potential. Take, for example, the circumstances of the play's publication in 1953 in a scholarly journal called Essays and Studies. In typical fashion, Tolkien had been revising The Homecoming possibly as early as 1931, maybe even earlier. When he was overdue in submitting something to Essays and Studies, as he had promised to do, he sent them The Homecoming, bookended at beginning and end with brief scholarly commentary on the historical battle in the introduction, and as a conclusion on Tolkien's interpretation of the Battle of Malden, and particularly one word in that Old English poem, Overmode, which he translated as Overmastering Pride. This essay, titled Overmode, is only evident in typescript in the last draft of the play. It has the appearance of a last-minute addition. In that essay, Tolkien admits that his primary purpose was to experiment with the verse form. This piece was composed primarily as verse to be condemned or approved as such. But then he adds, to merit a place in Essays and Studies, it must, I suppose, contain at least by implication criticism of the matter and manner of the Old English poem or of its critics. It's this critical material that drew scholarly attention away from considering the play as a play in verse, and instead focused on Tolkien's interpretation of Overmode, his comments on the Northern heroic spirit, and his application of that idea to the Battle of Malden, Beowulf, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The early performance history of the play also reinforces an idea that this is not a play for performance on stage. In fact, it works very well as a play for two voices, as BBC Radio proved in its broadcast in 1954 and rebroadcast in 1955, and as Tolkien's own recitation of the play into a tape recorder also illustrates. All you need are minimal sound effects to understand the play, the hooting of an owl, the creaking of a wagon, some noise in the scuffle with the corpse strippers. I'm sure various amateur groups have read or performed the play. I know of a Readers Theatre performance in Kalamazoo in 2008, and Skull and Hammond record a couple of others. Of course, I'd be happy to hear of any others that people know about. The Homecoming also works as a so-called closet drama, something never intended to be performed on stage that you can read for yourself, which is how most of us experience the play. The stage directions published in the play help you imagine the scene, including details such as shapes flitting through the light, or a character tripping over a lantern or letting out the light again, or in a final scene when we hear a voice in the dark chanting and the stage direction reads, "Monks bearing a bier amid tapers pass across the scene." Unless you have a narrator reading out these stage directions indicating visual details that are not explicitly referenced in the words of the play, well, these details would be missed in a radio broadcast or reader's theater performance, though Tolkien did tell BBC Radio that the play could work without them. And the details, of course, do work well as an indication for a production on stage. In his Overmode essay, Tolkien includes this footnote. It was indeed plainly intended as a recitation for two persons, two shapes in dim shadow, with the help of a few gleams of light and appropriate noises and a chant at the end. It has, of course, never been performed. Well, first of all, why of course? And I'll venture to say this is because this is the first instance of publishing the play, so no one's had a chance to perform it yet. The recitation for two persons, the noises and chant would suit a reader's theater or radio broadcast style of presentation. But then there are those shapes in dim shadow and the few gleams of light. These details suggest that Tolkien could see the play in his mind's eye as it might appear on a stage. In fact, in earlier drafts of the play, Tolkien writes directions that mention movement of characters going across stage, or the robbers sneaking up behind one of the characters at back and to one side. In later drafts, Tolkien pared down the stage directions, leaving the words themselves to suggest some of the actions that readers or actors or directors could interpret. But a few of those visual details, as illustrated in my previous slide, that can't be deduced from the speech of the two characters remain. Now, beyond the fact that Tolkien wrote a play, why should we care about the homecoming? Tolkien does pack a lot into a mere 350 lines or so, creating two characters who are distinctly drawn, expressing different views on war, poetry, and heroism. The play demonstrates a typical, I think, Tolkienian tension between two oppositions, what Verlyn Flieger identifies in her essay, The Arch and the Keystone, as the friction or the pressure of competing forces that are the mark of much of Tolkien's work. In the case of The Homecoming, Tolkien maintains in tension, on the one hand, a modern cynicism about leaders wasting the lives of young men in needless battle, expressed in a scene with dead and dismembered bodies in a ghostly atmosphere, and I find this quite typical of World War I poetry, actually. And on the other hand, there's medieval praise of heroism in poetry that idealizes and reintegrates the image of the fallen leader's body. I think that the difference between the two characters' attitudes can be exemplified in their reactions to finding Bertnoth's body. The older Tida says, well, here he is, or what heaven's left us, the longest legs in the land, I guess. While Tota, the poet, launches into a eulogy chanting, his head was higher than the helm of kings with heathen crowns. In other words, Tida looks down at the beheaded corpse. Tota imaginatively raises up the leader's image through poetry, eventually stating he's gone to God, glory seeking. Does Tolkien reject one of these views and prefer another? I don't think so. As Flieger recommends, it's best in dealing with Tolkien's work to let such contradictions live in opposition rather than trying to reconcile them. And in this regard, The Homecoming has much in common with Tolkien's other works. But one of the play's most unique features, and one of the reasons I think that it should be a text we pay attention to, is the one I've left to last in my discussion. This play is written in the style of Old English alliterative meter. In the earliest drafts, the first 4 drafts of the play in the Bodleian and 1 draft at Leeds, Tolkien writes in rhyming couplets. However, in Bodleian version E, and all drafts after that, he revises the play into alliterative meter, the verse form used by the early medieval English. And I think that The Homecoming is an alliterative tour de force, well worth our attention. Tolkien wrote that The Homecoming is not a poem, but a play in verse. And he states plainly his interest in the verse form, as we saw earlier when he writes, it was composed primarily as verse to be condemned or approved as such. And indeed, there's much to approve in Tolkien's original handling of the meter in modern English. In a 1952 letter, Tolkien refers to The Homecoming as a dramatic dialogue in real alliterative verse of various styles. What Tolkien considers to be real alliterative verse follows the metrical rules of Old English poetry with specific rhythmical half-line patterns and alliterative placements. As far as we know, Old English writers did not compose a guide to poetic meter, but in the 19th century, Edward Sievers analyzed 5 basic types of half-line rhythms with many subtypes, and Tolkien follows this system. He explains the basics in his essay on translating Beowulf. Now, there isn't time today to go into a detailed analysis, but just as a plug, I'm going to say that my thesis student, Rebecca Foster, and I are just about to publish a detailed analysis of The Homecoming's meter in the Journal of Tolkien Research, so that should appear any day now. For now, though, I'll also note that Tolkien says he's writing real alliterative verse of various styles. Tolkien's originality as a modern alliterative poet lies not only in the fact that he adhered to verse types typically used in Old English poetry, but also that he was able to flex and shape those verses to create various styles in modern English, from conversational passages to highly styled set pieces. Many people, I think, might imagine Old English poetry to be serious and sonorous and weighty, epic, and it can be, but Tolkien's also capable of writing completely informal lines, like my favorite when old Tita is getting tired hauling Birtna's body around, and he says, I'm in a stew of sweat. Anyway, you can hear the difference in the following lines. First, informal conversation. You stumbling dolt, look where you're going. For the Lord's pity, halt Tita here. Hark now and look. Look where, my lad. You can compare that to the change in register when Tota chants in praise of Bertnoth. Glory loved he, now glory earning, his grave shall be green, while ground or sea, while word or woe in the world lasteth. The care that Tolkien took in finding modern equivalents for the Old English Sievers types is evident in his manuscripts, where we can find several pages of notes listing over 100 examples of Old English metrical types and with their modern English equivalents. In fact, Tolkien's manuscripts contain many lectures on alliterative meter, the Old English poetic tradition, and specific poems such as the Battle of Maldon. There is so much there that he could have published as scholarly articles. But again, in a typical Tolkienian move, he uses his creative writing instead, in this case, The Homecoming, to illustrate his scholarly theories. I only have time today to suggest a few examples. In his lectures, Tolkien argues that poems in stricter meter like Beowulf and looser meter like the Battle of Maldon could coexist for different purposes, and he shows the two styles coexisting in his play. Tolkien also believes that the Battle of Maldon was a popular kind of poem, as he says, made to celebrate events while news of them was still hot. And in his fiction, Tota will be the poet who composes the Battle of Maldon shortly after examining the battlefield. Also in his lectures, Tolkien discusses how poets might have learned their craft in an era when there were no handbooks or schools. And he writes that with some practice, a boy having some bent for these things can quickly grasp the scheme of even fairly intricate rules. And he gives us just such a young man in Tota, the son of a minstrel who must have heard plenty of poetry at home and who can echo passages from Beowulf and the Battle of Brunanburg in his set pieces. But it's not just Tota who is an alliterative poet of some skill. Tolkien's Homecoming also demonstrates how a 20th century writer could compose a variety of alliterative verses in modern English. Tolkien frequently advocates for the use of alliterative meter in modern English poetry. In one of his lectures, he claims that alliterative meter is quite worthy of study by poets today as a technique. And The Homecoming demonstrates not only how Tolkien has mastered modern alliterative verse, but also how he's created his own original genre, a modern play in alliterative verse. In conclusion, I'll just say that there are many reasons, I think, to care about The Homecoming. It has resonance with Tolkien's other fiction. It illustrates some of his scholarly theories. It demonstrates the potential of modern alliterative verse, and it is a unique piece of playwriting in Tolkien's body of work. And I certainly hope that one day I can get to see a full-blown production on the stage.
Thank you, Anna. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, we have room for our questions and comments now. Make sure that I see our the Q&A. Remember, if you just post your questions in the Q&A, I can read them out for Anna. And while people are typing and thinking about their questions, may I say, Anna, I'll take this time to start with just a comment. I love this piece. I love Homecoming so much. I teach it in every Tolkien class. I teach it in my English 22 Romantics, Victorians, and Moderns class. I teach it kind of alongside the World War I and World War II poets as a commentary on war by Tolkien. And I just think it's a phenomenal piece. And the line, hearing the tears to the harps twanging, just encapsulates everything that as far
really. Like I said, he packs a lot into about 350 lines. There's a lot there to explore.
There really is, absolutely, yes. It's yes. Bergtown we bury here, not Beowulf, my lad. And yeah, so much.
Yeah.
Okay, Marilyn. Oh, so wonderful to have Marilyn here. And his question is, in his own recording, Tolkien replaces the dirige at the end with the anachronistic deis irae. Any thoughts on why that might be?
No, I don't have any particular thoughts right now, but he did change that. And he did change that, I think also, or he suggested that it could be changed for the BBC radio broadcast, but I haven't had a chance to look at that closely. I think he mentioned somewhere, he commented somewhere that, it would do just as well. It fits with the theme, but I haven't looked at that closely yet. But that is one of the elements in the play that I would like to look at in the future.
Great question. Could we, and some other questions and comments?
Chris, while we're waiting for a couple questions to come in, would you mind sharing if there's an update to the lunch schedule?
Yes, in fact, there is going to be an update because at after our lunch, we have Brad Eden's paper. Brad could not make it today as he is traveling across country to finally be with his family, with whom he had been estranged just because of the pandemic. So I will be reading his paper, and I won't be taking any questions, obviously, and it's only about a 15-minute read. So we're going to go from 12 until 12:45 for lunch instead of 12:30. All right, so we'll resume 12:45 with my reading of Brad's paper. We have a question from John Holmes for Anna, and that is, what is the relative date of the Leeds manuscript? Contemporary with the others?
That it's the Brotherton Library dates it as coming from as dated in the 1920s. Scull and Hammond think that is incorrect, and I've looked at that manuscript in terms of the revisions made. To me, it looks like it comes after version B, the second version in the Bodleian Library, just given the revisions, the variants. So either the Leeds manuscript is actually later than is indicated in the Brotherton Library, or the first Bodleian Library manuscripts are earlier. And I haven't been able to dig any deeper than that. I asked the Leeds librarians why it was dated 1925 or something like that, and they said that was the date that they got from the auction house. And I think Scull and Hammond comment that that simply might be a guess because Tolkien was working at Leeds in the 1920s, and they thought maybe it came from that time. So the dating is tricky, but it is I think in a series of revisions that we can see from the earliest Bodleian versions, and it's not early. I don't think it's earlier than any of those.
Thank you so much, Anna. We have another question from Jane. Anna, why do you think Tolkien chose to create this historical event as a play? Why this incident? Why in this genre as opposed to as a poem?
Yeah, well, it is a play in verse, and he's imitating in many ways the kind of looser alliterative verse of the Battle of Malden. But why a play? I don't know, except that it is. It doesn't deal with his secondary world, so it is an historical event, and maybe he felt freer to have create a dialogue between characters in that kind of an historical context. But I haven't seen any other indication of why he would make it a play.
Thanks, Anna. Any other questions? We have a minute or two. Nancy? Could Nancy type something in the Q&A? Nancy typed something in the chat. Is that will the notes be published? That's for Anna, I suppose.
Notes. I can. Do you mean the references that I've used, or?
That's a good question.
I didn't include a slide with works cited because usually it's too small type. No one can follow that. But I will put a works cited list on my blog at annasmol.net, so you can find it there. And of course, there will be full footnotes or endnotes and work references in the Journal of Tolkien Research article that, as I said, should come out very soon.
I, for one, am very much looking forward to that. That's going to be great. All right. Thank you very much, Anna, for your wonderful paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes. Y'all, I chat for I'm clapping for everybody.